What's up, Theory Creeps? Welcome back to another episode of The Theory Creep, which I gotta admit is coming a little bit sooner than I expected it to, but I guess that's what she said.
Okay, first of all, Steve Carell owns That's What She Said. He owns it.
Anyway, I've been watching a lot of other YouTubers, obviously. I've got a lot of free time on my hands, and I'm noticing something pretty cool that they're doing that I'm not doing that I'd like to try, which is a consistent series of videos where we talk about one subject over several videos. And, it really lets us dig into one slightly more complicated subject, I guess. I'm noticing other people do this with books, so maybe we'll bring one book into this discussion and kind of refer back to it from different angles. We'll see what happens. I mean, I've got nothing else to do, right? I'm just locked down in my apartment. I may as well make some content. I may as well connect with people digitally if I'm not able to connect with people physically, which, if I'm being honest, has always been my preference. So in my last video about Bible fruit and Aqua Teen Hunger Force, I asked, what does post-structuralism look like after COVID? Is the solipsism and the kind of anti-truth stance of the post-structuralist still relevant in a post-COVID world? And I'll admit, I was pretty panicky as I was making that video, partially as a joke, partially, authentically. But I think I forgot something very important about postmodernism and post-structuralism, and that is that they come out of World War II. These disciplines come from a time that was much, much, much worse than what we're dealing with now, and frankly, was probably much worse than anything we're going to deal with as a result of COVID. I mean, global warming, World War III, who knows? They'll probably be worse than World War II, but this pandemic is not going to be as awful and tragic and earth-shattering as, all of the events of World War II. So let's try to keep that in mind as we read post-structuralist theory in relation to COVID. So without further ado, let's begin the Theory Creep Lockdown Edition. So I know it's not good for me, but all this time alone has kind of made me confront an old addiction of mine. I used to have the willpower to stay away from it, but now that I'm just at home all the time, I'm talking about political press conferences. They're just so twistedly entertaining. Now, I'm not American, so I don't get the good stuff locally. I got to go international if I want that raw press conference shit. But I mean, I gotta tell you, Donald Trump, no one delivers a press conference like him. He's a mad lad, right? He doesn't stick to facts. He says whatever he wants. He makes these very superficial, very discourse-focused arguments. And what I mean is that his arguments occupy the realm of words, not the realm of reality. And the words that he speaks kind of create this semi-real, fluxy reality that supports his arguments for about 5 minutes until he walks off stage, and then they're contradicted. But what people remember is what he said when he was on stage. So presidents have always had a kind of performative speech. They've always brought what they speak about into being. But Trump has this very cool ability. I mean, it's cool to a post-structuralist who's kind of detached and cynical like me. I mean, it's terrifying if you're actually the result, or if you actually have to bear the results of what he says and what he does. But anyway, his detachment from reality is really, really fascinating to me. And specifically, the reaction that the left has to Trump's detachment from reality really fascinates me. You've got people like Trevor Noah, Chris Hayes, Joe Scarborough, Rachel Maddow, John Oliver. All of these people have really made a career out of identifying the insanity that the Republican Party, and specifically Trump, pumps out. All they do is they say, this is something that Trump said, this is why it's not true. And they're really leaning into truth. Now, I mean, I'm at home and a lot of these shows are off the air. So I've been watching Sam Cinder. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. He's pretty cool. He's like a leftist radio host who now has a YouTube channel. I'm sure you know who he is. He's got like 1 million subscribers. But yeah, I've been enjoying watching him. And the other day I saw this clip.
The 25th, CDC and my administration are doing a great job of handling it. I think on the 25th, I think it's a problem that's going to go away. They have studied it. They know very much. In fact, we're very close to a vaccine. He didn't, no idea what he's talking about. They've tried a vaccine on someone the other day. It's going to be 18 months before anybody, if it works.
So I think this is really indicative of the fact that the left relies on developmental arguments. You know, they present a series of evidence that builds to a conclusion, and that evidence is obviously rooted in what they identify as facts, and frankly, what most of the world would identify as facts. But that's a very particular kind of argumentation. And it's not a kind of argumentation that is really supported by poststructuralists. Poststructuralists really set out to dismantle that developmental kind of argumentation. But by dwelling on the surface, the alt-right and Trump are really capitalizing on the postmodernism and the superficiality and the hyper-reality of the modern world in a way that I'm not seeing the left do. And I think this is especially apparent during the COVID crisis, where facts matter, right? Like I said in my last video, hand washing practices are different than gargling bleach. One is effective, one is harmful. So in this time period that we're in right now, like, facts are important, and you've got a president who's talking complete nonsense. So it feels like this is a good time to talk about post-structural theory, because there are times when it feels like Trump is using post-structural theory to his advantage. Like when he's on stage, when Trump is on stage and he tells people about a miracle drug, what's it called? Anyway, I can't find it on my script. So when Trump is on stage and he's talking about a miracle drug that's he probably heard about on fucking Alex Jones or something, and that it's designed to cure Ebola and it has nothing to do with COVID. So he's on stage talking about that, and it's obviously a deflection. It's obviously an attempt to distract people from the fact that he's been downplaying this crisis for the last 2 weeks. But I really think they're missing the point. Trump isn't trying to assemble a rational argument based on evidence. He's literally trying to deflect this stuff, and it's working. And I don't think the left really understands why it's working. They're just kind of baffled. I think the left really wants to make this about education and about educated audiences and educated voters and undereducated audiences and undereducated voters. And the assumption there is that if people knew the truth, they wouldn't fall victim to lies, as if this hierarchy between lie and truth is like built right into reality. I think the left wants us to see that Trump is tricking his supporters, but I don't think that's what's happening. I don't think Trump is fooling anyone. I think his supporters are just relieved to finally have a representative who's like them, who's virtual, who's a performance, who's superficial, who doesn't rely on this depth of narrative and this depth of evidence that the left does, and that really that's becoming less and less popular in the modern world. We're becoming more and more a hyper-real society, a superficial society, and the left seems to be fighting against that. And it's not just a conservative trend. The whole world is becoming more superficial, and the left seems to want to obfuscate that. The left wants us to forget that the world is superficial, and they want us to see them as like the torchbearers of truth. But that's a really suspect concept these days. When Trump supporters say things like he's just like me, or he says what's on his mind, this is code for he's messy and dirty and virtual and superficial, just like me. He's not pre-planned. His performance is overtly a performance. It's not scripted and managed the way most politicians are. That's where his appeal comes from. But this infuriates leftist pundits. Like during the G7 conference, I remember Rachel Maddow freaking out over someone asked him, like, what are you going to do about a trade war with China? Like, are you interested in going into a trade war with China? Is that something that's going to happen? And Trump's response was, yeah, sure, why not? And like, yeah, excuse me. And like, yeah, on the one hand, that's really scary because he's the leader of the free world and he seems very blasé about a trade war that would affect billions of people. But on the other hand, yeah, sure, why not, is a pretty modern response. It's pretty tied into the zeitgeist of our time, the kind of ambivalent, superficial, like Trump isn't just appealing to conservatives when he says stuff like that, is what I'm trying to say. I know I'm going to catch some, well, I mean, if I had an audience beyond the 100 people that watch me, thanks for watching me, my 100 people that watch me. I really appreciate you. But I think if I had a bigger audience, I'd catch some blowback for this. But I'll just say it. Trump is a postmodern genius. He uses the tenets of postmodernism and he exists in the postmodern media landscape more effectively than almost anyone else I've ever seen. Like the death of meta-narratives, the ahistoriosity of the postmodern world, like these are tools for Trump. He uses these to stay in power and to avoid crises and to, you know, to like, he's like a duck. Nothing sticks to him because he's so willing to occupy these superficial, flexible positions. So as leftists, like what can we do about someone who's using postmodern strategies the way Trump is? How can we respond to the postmodern alt-right? Up until this point, it seems like we've been trying to return political discourse to a more rational, truth-based kind of discussion. It's not working, and I really think that the better alternative is for the left to also lean in to postmodern, poststructural kind of principles. Remember that these principles were written by leftists like Derrida, Foucault, Levinas, Baudrillard. These dudes were like hardcore leftists. Like Walter Benjamin was a fucking Marxist. Like a lot of these guys were Marxists, actually. I don't think Derrida or Foucault were, but anyway, like these principles are rooted in the left. The conservatives have transplanted them into their culture. Like, for example, I saw this on Sam's YouTube channel, but it didn't come from him. Here, I'll put it up.
Vaccines, I think, relatively soon.
Not only the vaccines, but the therapies. Therapies is sort of another word for cure.
We're talking about very small numbers in the United States.
Our numbers are lower than just about anybody. It's really working out, and a lot of good things are going to happen.
And we are responding with great speed and professionalism.
It's going to go away.
Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all.
We're going to all be great. We're going to be so good. This came up, it came up so suddenly.
This is a pandemic. I felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic. All you had to do is look at other countries.
This video is trying to make a clear, rational argument. Like it's a historical argument. Like it's literally based on dates. But we live in an ahistorical time. All that matters is what's happening right now. Once something is an hour old, it's dead. Especially now that COVID has come around. The news cycle, where it used to be a 24-hour news cycle, now it's like a 1-hour news cycle. Things change from hour to hour in the day. So what Trump said a week ago, no one is thinking about. So the fact that this video is trying to assemble an argument based on this historical narrative in such an ahistorical time is alarming to me. It shows me that the left is completely choosing to ignore the postmodern principles that guide culture today. So what would a postmodern leftist argument look like? I'm a bad person to ask that. I haven't watched a press conference since the Iraqi war. Like fucking Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush were the last guys I saw deliver a press conference. So I live under a rock, politically speaking. But if I had to say what a leftist political discourse would look like once it embraced postmodernism, I have to look towards processes like deconstruction. I think that if we look at how Derrida or the poststructuralists deconstructed Platonic narratives or Christian narratives, I think we could gain a lot from looking at those processes. Now, there's lots of definitions of deconstruction out there that are much more clear and well thought out than what I'm about to present to you. But for the purposes of this video, and probably this series of videos, deconstruction for us will mean working to disassemble a subject from within that subject, using tools that are provided by the subject of your analysis to dismantle that subject. It's a superficial process. It doesn't rely on deep historical evidence, on historical narratives. It's pretty simple. Like, it occupies the level of the surface. Where it does dive into historical evidence, it's usually, entomological. I hope I'm not using the term that refers to insects. It's like the history of words is when deconstruction tends to use historical evidence. Derrida in particular will generally present like an argument based on how a word was used in the past. They'll say like, well, the author didn't mean to say this necessarily, but the word that they used has several possible interpretations, and this interpretation supports my argument, even though it probably wouldn't support the author's argument if we're deconstructing a book, for example. I like to think about deconstruction like a karate fighter. He comes into combat with nothing but his empty hands, and he uses his opponent's weapons against him. I'm a big dweeb. So the first piece of alt-right propaganda I'd like to talk about is an empty book called A History of the Palestinian People by Asaf Vol. It's like a piece of Zionist anti-Palestinian propaganda. It's pretty gross when you think about it. It's a 132-page book with nothing on it except for the title page, which is A History of the Palestinian People, with a Palestinian flag on it. And I think there's a quote on the first page that reads, "It's not a lie if you believe it." It's from Seinfeld. Just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it, is they're the only words on this 132-page book. So what's going on with this book? Well, the implication is that the Palestinian state isn't real and never has been. Like I said, it's super fucked up. It's definitely like hyper-Zionist, really hateful. It feels like a Nazi thing to say, which I realize is a little bit uncouth when you're talking about a Jewish person, but it does. It's just a gross piece of propaganda. But it's so vague, it's so soft, it's so postmodern that I think the author unintentionally left themselves open to a very, very obvious route of deconstruction. So it's a common right-wing argument that the Palestinian state is a fabrication. It justifies the apartheid and the abuse that the Israeli state inflicts on the Palestinian people, or the Palestinian state, depending on whatever phraseology you want to use. The pages of the book, the empty pages of the book, are meant to imply that it's all a lie. There is no Palestinian state, that Israel isn't dismantling, an actual nation. It's just a leftist kind of fabrication that Palestine exists. You could say that the book is implying that the Palestinian identity is a performance, that it's not authentic. But as we've seen in past videos on this channel, performance is really how everything is manufactured. The Israeli identity is no less performed than the Palestinian identity. Everyone is just putting on a play of who they are. No one is actually who they present themselves as. So let's ask ourselves, what is the lie that the book is referring to? So let's break it down a little bit. This author, Asaf Vol, wants us to think that the Palestinian state is a lie, that the lie is the existence of the Palestinian state. But you could also read this book as presenting the case that the lie surrounding the Palestine-Israel conflict is that there is no Palestinian state, that in actual fact the Palestinian state existed and exists in Gaza and the West Bank, and is being suppressed and erased by the Israeli government. This book could be a tragic joke. It could easily have been, and honestly, this is what I thought when I first came across it, before I did some research into who Asaf Vol was, who was supporting this book, the fact that it was written in Hebrew. I didn't know all of that when I first heard about it, and my first assumption was that this was a tragic joke at the expense of Israel about how Israel and the alt-right and the right and neocons in general have just erased an entire nation. So I guess to put it simply, the lie of this book could be, and the text of the book supports this lie as much as the lie that it wants to tell. The lie of the book could be that Palestine is not real. The truth is that Israel is no more real than Palestine, and any nation is really no more real than any other. All national identities are just these elaborate, superficial presentations. But again, I just want to emphasize that in the postmodern world, I believe that that's all anything is. So I'm not trying to diminish Israeli identity or Palestinian identity. I just want to equalize them and say that they're both superficial presentations. Now, I think that this reading probably comes from my personal biases. I have a lot of sympathy for the people of Palestine. I know a few Palestinians, and the conditions that they left when they came to Canada are it's crazy. So what I'm trying to say is that I have a bias that is definitely anti-Israel and pro-Palestine. So that's probably informing my reading of this text. So let's try to get out of that. Let's try to get out of the Palestine is a real nation. Maybe Palestine isn't a real nation. Maybe it's more than a real nation. Any real, quote-unquote, nation that was subjected to the conditions that Palestine and Palestinians lived through would have dissolved long ago. So Palestine may be more than real. It may be hyper-real. It may be a ghost, which I think is exactly what Asaf Vol is trying to do with his book. He's trying to turn Palestine into a ghost. But the truth is that once something is a ghost, it can haunt you. And that might explain why the perpetrators of apartheid can't stamp out Palestine the way that they want to. So as you can see, deconstruction doesn't provide a clear, rational, alternative position to the subject that it's deconstructing, to the thing that it's opposed to. And I think that's one of the things that turns people off about it. We want, generally speaking, when we're confronted with something that we're opposed to, we want a clear path to taking it down, right? We don't want this messy, subjective, self-referential, self-considering deconstruction of the thing. We want a clear method of attack. And that's not what deconstruction gives you. Maybe the karate fighter isn't a great metaphor. Maybe I should have said, and this really shows you how much of a martial arts dweeb I am. Maybe the deconstructionist is more like an Aikido fighter. They walk into a fight with nothing, and they like the karate fighter, they may use what their opponent brings against them. But the Aikido fighter is going to use momentum against their opponent. It's not just that they're going to disarm their opponent and then strike them with their weapons. They're going to use the very momentum and the very speed and power that the opponent thinks is working to their advantage against them, when you hip throw them or whatever. Okay, that's enough talking about martial arts. So I want to close by talking about these very encouraging series of YouTube videos that I saw yesterday. They're on they're by a guy who does 3D printing. He has like a small YouTube channel where he 3D prints stuff and makes videos about it. The maker culture is pretty cool. I've never gotten into it because I guess I bought a camera instead of a 3D printer. But yeah, super cool video. So this guy, in this like amazing act of ingenuity, has basically assembled a low-cost DIY ventilator where it's like a sleep apnea mask and like an air pump that like pumps air through the mask. Now it's not safe, and a few doctors have chimed in and said like, if you're going to die, maybe you could use this, but in almost any other circumstance, go to a hospital and use a real ventilator. So as a ventilator, this device is not very effective, although you got to commend the guy's ingenuity, whether or not it worked. Super cool project. But one of the doctors who commented on the ventilator suggested that the guy had basically built a powered air purifying respirator, a PAPR. So essentially what the guy said was like, what the doctor said was, if you can't breathe, this device will probably not help you breathe very much, and it might hurt you in the process of helping you breathe. But if you're able to breathe and you attach an air filter to the air pump, this device will pump clean air into your face and you can inhale and exhale normally because you're conscious and alert. So as a piece of personal protective equipment, this guy had accidentally created a pretty effective low-cost kit for respirators, which as you probably know, are in very short supply in North America. So now we can look at our inventory of sleep apnea masks and of air mattress pumps, and we can say like, okay, now we have 5 million more respirators than we thought we did. But anyway, this story is really encouraging because, to me anyway, it seems like a postmodern approach to problem solving. It's happening outside of institutions that usually are the kind of privileged holders of authority. It's a group non-linear discussion where it moves in one direction that doesn't really work, but then we pick up on a few useful things from that movement and then we carry it in another direction. And it's not directed by one person. It's directed by kind of group input. I think it's a beautiful approach to problem solving. And if there's one good thing that comes out of this COVID process, I mean, I know a lot of people are hoping that this COVID process, this COVID tragedy, catastrophe that we're living through is going to, make us move more to the left, make us get more, like in the States, maybe get more universal health care, universal basic income. That would be great. Although I don't really see it happening. But what I do see happening is a tremendous improvement in the integration between industry and maker culture, which could be very, very promising. And like I said, I think is a little bit postmodern. So I think we're going to call it there because this video is getting a little bit long. I didn't get to a book. I'm not sure if I'm going to. With this series. If I do get to a book, it will be The Writing of the Disaster by Maurice Blanchot. It's a book about disasters and about how writing is a disaster. The cover is a Torah from that was I think it was buried in Auschwitz, and now it's in a Holocaust museum. Anyway, I think it's pretty relevant to what we're going through. Like I said, postmodernism and poststructuralism, they come out of disasters. They come out of catastrophes. They're a reaction to the kind of environment that we're in right now. So I feel like there's probably some useful lessons that we can pull out of these postmodernist theories and apply to the world we live in now. So with that in mind, we'll end our first lockdown video, and I'll get to work on editing it right now. It'll go up in the near future. And to be honest, I think this lockdown is going to go on longer than anyone expected, so you'll probably get another one pretty soon. So we'll see you then. Theater Creep out.